The sky was a soft gray, misting lightly with rain as Daria Coulson made her way through the winding paths of the cemetery. A bouquet of lilies clutched tightly in her hand, she approached her late husband Jade's grave, her heart heavy with grief and lingering questions. It had been almost 2 years since Jade's sudden passing, a loss that left her reeling, isolated, and bitter. The silence in their once bustling home was unbearable, each empty room a painful reminder of his absence. But today, something was different. As she neared his resting place, Daria noticed a small figure kneeling by the grave, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Daria's footsteps slowed, her breath catching in her throat. The child looked so small and frail, her tiny frame cloaked in a worn, oversized coat that seemed barely able to shield her from the cold drizzle. Her hair was tied back in untamed curls, and her hands were pressed into the damp earth as if trying to ground herself to the spot. Daria couldn't make out the girl's features from where she stood, but something about the scene tugged painfully at her heart. Taking a hesitant step forward, Daria cleared her throat softly. Who are you?" she asked, her voice breaking the solemn quiet of the cemetery. She hadn't expected anyone to be here, let alone a child. The little girl looked up, startled, her tear-streaked face turning toward Daria. The moment their eyes met, Daria felt a strange, unsettling familiarity in the child's gaze. Her large, expressive eyes seemed to carry an unbearable sadness, an emotion Daria knew all too well. The girl's lips trembled as she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. This is my father," she said, glancing back at the headstone before meeting Daria's gaze again. "Who are you?" Daria felt her chest tighten, her heart pounding in a chaotic rhythm. Your father," she stammered, her mind racing. "But, Jade, he was my husband." The words stumbled out of her mouth, her mind unable to process the enormity of what the girl was implying. The child looked down, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if she were bracing herself for a reaction. He used to visit me at the orphanage," she said, her voice wavering. "He told me that one day he'd bring me home, that he introduced me to my family. But he never came back." Daria's mind reeled as she struggled to grasp the implications of the girl's words. Jade had never mentioned any other children. They had tried for years to have a family, only to face heartache after heartache. When he was alive, Jade had been the epitome of a dedicated husband, kind, loving, supportive, or so she had thought. The realization struck her with the force of a hammer blow. There had been a secret, a hidden life that Jade had kept from her. And this child, this young girl with sorrowful eyes, was the living embodiment of that hidden truth. The bouquet of lilies slipped from Daria's hand, landing with a soft thud on the wet ground. She took a step back, feeling the world spin around her. This was too much. She couldn't handle this. She turned on her heel, ready to flee, to escape this unbearable revelation. But as she moved, a small, trembling hand reached out and caught hers, holding tight with surprising strength. "Please, don't go," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of the rain. "I ran away from the orphanage to see him, to say goodbye. I thought maybe you'd be able to help me. I don't have anyone else." Daria's first instinct was to pull away, to shake off the little girl's hand and leave this painful encounter behind. But something in the child's voice, a quiet desperation, a plea for connection, stirred a reluctant empathy within her. She looked down at the girl's hand clutching her own, noticing for the first time the small details, the frayed edges of her coat sleeves, the smudges of dirt on her palms, the way her fingers trembled slightly with the cold. What's your name?" Daria asked, her tone softening despite herself. "Desiree," the girl replied, her voice a timid whisper. "But everyone calls me Dizzy." Daria swallowed hard, her emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and confusion. She looked away, trying to steel herself against the flood of feelings threatening to overwhelm her. "Dizzy, I don't know what you want from me," she said, her voice barely holding steady. I can't just take you in. Daisy's gaze fell, her shoulders slumping in defeat. I understand, she murmured, her voice so soft Daria could barely hear it. I just thought maybe you'd want to know. An awkward silence hung between them, the only sounds the distant rumble of thunder and the gentle patter of rain on the leaves. Daria's mind was racing, caught between her shock over Jade's betrayal and an unexpected pang of sympathy for this fragile child standing before her. She didn't owe this girl anything. And yet, a part of her couldn't bear the thought of leaving her here, alone and abandoned, just as Jade had. Taking a deep breath, Daria made a decision. Come with me, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. Daisy looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. But she didn't question it. Silently, she followed Daria out of the cemetery, her small, wet footsteps echoing against the gravel path as they made their way toward Daria's car. In the quiet solitude of the drive, Daria's thoughts churned restlessly. She couldn't help but wonder how Jade could have kept this secret from her, how he could have fathered a child and left her in an orphanage. Her heart twisted with bitterness, a painful reminder of all the things she didn't know about the man she had loved and trusted. And yet, as she glanced at Daisy's reflection in the rearview mirror, the girl's head resting against the car window, her eyes closed in exhaustion, she felt a strange sense of responsibility stirring within her. Daisy was innocent in all of this. Whatever secrets Jade had kept, this child had no part in them. And maybe, just maybe, helping her wouldn't be a betrayal of her own grief. Perhaps it could be a way to honor Jade's memory, flawed as it was, by giving his daughter a chance at the life he had promised her. But as they pulled into the driveway of Daria's modest suburban home, an uneasy feeling settled in her chest. She had made a decision, yes, but she wasn't sure if it was the right one. Could she truly take in this child, this unexpected reminder of her husband's hidden life? Or was she setting herself up for even more heartache? As they stepped inside, Daria's mind buzzed with doubts. But for now, there was no turning back. Daria's home was modest, nestled at the end of a quiet street lined with maple trees. It was the kind of neighborhood where every house looked similar, and neighbors knew one another by sight, if not by name. The living room was filled with muted tones of grays and beiges, and the faint scent of lavender from an air freshener lingered in the air. The house was neat, organized, almost too orderly, like it hadn't seen the chaotic touch of a child in years. Daria hadn't allowed herself to hope for that kind of life after her miscarriages, and she'd stopped imagining the sounds of little feet running through the hallways a long time ago. Daisy stood at the doorway, her small, damp frame looking out of place against the backdrop of this pristine, quiet home. She clutched her coat tightly around her, her wide eyes scanning the room with a mixture of awe and wariness. It was clear she wasn't used to places like this, places that seemed untouched, where everything had a place and a purpose. Her gaze lingered on the family photos on the walls, pictures of Daria and Jade, smiling at various vacation spots, their arms wrapped around each other, looking happy and carefree. To Daisy, these images were like windows into a life she'd never known. Daria cleared her throat, breaking the silence. "You can sit down if you'd like," she said, gesturing to the sofa. Daisy hesitated, glancing at the couch like she was afraid she'd dirty it just by sitting on it. She finally settled down, perching on the edge of the seat with her hands folded in her lap, like a guest who didn't want to overstay her welcome. An uncomfortable silence settled over them. Daria wasn't sure what to do, what to say. She had agreed to bring Daisy home, but now that they were here, she felt woefully unprepared. She had never envisioned herself as a mother, especially not to a child from a hidden chapter of her late husband's life. The reality of her decision was beginning to weigh heavily on her, and for a moment, she wondered if she'd made a mistake. Daria sighed, trying to push the doubts aside. She walked to the kitchen, opening cabinets, searching for something to offer the girl. "Are you hungry, Daisy?" she called out, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. Daisy looked up, surprised. "Yes, Mom," she replied softly, her voice barely audible. Daria cringed at the formality, the forced politeness. This was not how a child should feel in what was supposed to be her home, but she let it go. She wasn't sure what Dizzy liked, so she made a simple peanut butter and jelly sandwich, cutting off the crusts and slicing it diagonally, just as she had imagined doing for her own child, back when she still dreamed of becoming a mother. When she returned, she placed the plate on the coffee table in front of Dizzy. The girl's eyes lit up at the sight of the food, and she reached out hesitantly, as though waiting for permission. Daria nodded, and Dizzy took a small bite, savoring each mouthful. It struck Daria how hungry she must have been, but more than that, it pained her to see how accustomed Dizzy was to holding back, to waiting for approval, to approaching everything as if she weren't worthy of it. Daria sat down in the armchair opposite her, studying Dizzy as she ate. She wanted to ask her questions: how long she'd been in the orphanage, why Jade had kept her a secret, what she had known of him. But she felt awkward, almost afraid to ask. How could she explain her own confusion, her own betrayal, without hurting this innocent child? How could she reconcile the man she thought she knew with the one who had kept such a monumental part of his life hidden from her? After a few moments of silence, Dizzy looked up, her eyes wide and earnest. Did he talk about me?" she asked, her voice tentative. The question hit Daria like a punch. She didn't know how to answer. She wanted to lie, to say yes, that Jade had spoken of her often, that he had cherished her memory even in silence. But that would have been dishonest, and Daria was too raw, too bitter to pretend. "No," she replied quietly, almost in a whisper. He didn't mention you." Dizzy's face fell, but she nodded as if she understood. "He came to visit me sometimes," she murmured, almost to herself. "He'd tell me stories about places he'd been. He promised he'd take me with him one day. He said he'd show me the world." Her voice was filled with a wistful longing, a fragile hope that broke Daria's heart. "I don't understand," Daria muttered, more to herself than to Dizzy. "Why didn't he tell me? Why didn't he bring you home?" Dizzy looked away, her hands twisting in her lap. "He said he had to wait. That one day, things would be right, and he'd come for me." She paused, her eyes brimming with tears. "But he never came back." A cold knot of anger and sadness twisted in Daria's chest. She felt betrayed, not just by Jade, but by this entire situation, by the layers of secrecy that had unraveled so painfully. She wanted to scream, to demand answers from a man who was no longer here to give them. And she wanted, somehow, to protect this girl sitting before her, so vulnerable, so lost. Without thinking, Daria reached out, placing a hand on Dizzy's shoulder. I'm sorry, Dizzy," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. I didn't know about any of this." Dizzy's gaze softened, her expression one of quiet acceptance. "It's okay," she said, as though trying to comfort Daria, even though she was the one who needed solace. "I'm just glad to be here. I thought I'd never meet you." Daria pulled her hand back, feeling an unexpected warmth in the gesture. She was still reeling, still unsure, but a small part of her felt a sense of responsibility. She couldn't erase the past, couldn't bring Jade back to explain himself. But she could try, somehow, to offer Dizzy a safe place, a home. "Why don't you go upstairs and rest?" Daria suggested, standing up. "There's a room down the hall on the left. You can use that." Dizzy nodded, her eyes brightening slightly. She rose from the sofa, clutching her coat, and made her way to the stairs. Daria watched her go, feeling a pang of something: pity, sympathy, perhaps even a budding sense of care. It was strange, this feeling. She hadn't felt it in years, hadn't let herself feel it. But as she watched Dizzy disappear down the hall, a part of her softened, just a little. When Dizzy was out of sight, Daria slumped back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The enormity of everything hit her all at once. She had invited this child into her home, A child who was the living embodiment of Jade's betrayal, and yet she couldn't find it in her heart to turn her away. It felt as if by helping Dizzy, she was somehow finding closure, making peace with her own grief. Upstairs, Dizzy found the room Daria had mentioned. It was small but cozy, with a bed, a dresser, and a window that overlooked the backyard. Dizzy placed her coat on the bed, looking around with a mixture of awe and disbelief. She had never had a space like this, a place that felt warm, safe. As she climbed into bed, pulling the covers up to her chin, she felt a sense of hope she hadn't known in a long time. It wasn't the promise of a new family or even a stable home, but it was something. It was a chance. And as Daria sat alone downstairs, staring blankly into the quiet, she realized that perhaps this child was offering her something as well. A chance to heal, to forgive, to move forward. But neither of them knew yet that this fragile peace would be tested, that the secrets of Jade's past would soon resurface, threatening to shatter the delicate bond forming between them. The days that followed were awkward, marked by quiet exchanges and cautious glances as Daria and Dizzy tried to adjust to this new, unexpected arrangement. Daria had no experience caring for a child, let alone one who was a reminder of her husband's betrayal. Every time she looked at Dizzy, a mixture of emotions swirled within her: anger, betrayal, guilt, and an unexpected tenderness she didn't want to admit. Dizzy, on the other hand, was careful to stay out of Daria's way. She was used to blending into the background, accustomed to a life in which she was often ignored or barely tolerated. Yet here in this new home, she held on to a faint hope that maybe, just maybe, she could belong somewhere, even if her presence was a constant reminder of an unresolved past. One evening, as a light rain tapped against the windows, Daria found herself in her bedroom, sorting through a box of old photographs she'd stored away after Jade's death. She hadn't been ready to confront those memories, but with Dizzy now under her roof, she felt compelled to look for answers. She needed to understand who her husband had been, to find some thread of truth in the tangled web he'd left behind. As she sifted through the photos, her fingers brushed over a picture of Jade, taken during a vacation in Italy. He was laughing, his head thrown back, completely at ease. It was the man she had known and loved, or so she thought. But now that image felt like a stranger's face, a man who had held secrets she might never fully uncover. A quiet knock on her door pulled her from her thoughts. She looked up to see Dizzy standing in the doorway, her small frame silhouetted by the hallway light. "Is it okay if I get some water?" Dizzy asked, her voice hesitant, as if she were afraid of intruding. Daria forced a smile, trying to mask the turmoil inside her. "Of course. You don't have to ask for permission." Dizzy nodded, but she didn't leave right away. Instead, she lingered in the doorway, her gaze flicking toward the box of photos on Daria's bed. "Are those pictures of him?" Daria stiffened, caught off guard by the question. She didn't know if she was ready to share this part of her life with Dizzy, this reminder of the man who had broken both their hearts in different ways. But as she looked into Dizzy's hopeful eyes, she felt a pang of sympathy. This girl, too, had lost Jade. She deserved something, even if it was only fragments of the past he'd kept hidden from her. Daria nodded, gesturing for Dizzy to come closer. "Yes. Would you like to see them?" Dizzy's face brightened, and she cautiously walked over to the bed, settling beside Daria as they sifted through the photos together. She stared at each picture with a reverence that made Daria's heart ache. Jade had been a father she'd never known, and now these photographs were her only connection to him. "That's him," Dizzy whispered, running a gentle finger over a photo of Jade standing by the beach. His arm was around Daria, both of them looking so young and full of hope. Dizzy's gaze lingered on his face, as if trying to memorize every detail. Daria studied Dizzy's expression, the way her eyes softened, the faint smile tugging at her lips. She saw herself in that longing, that hunger for something that had been taken away too soon. The bitterness in her heart loosened slightly, just enough to let a flicker of compassion seep in. He loved the ocean, Daria said quietly, surprising herself. She hadn't spoken about Jade's love for the sea in years, hadn't shared these memories with anyone. He always said it made him feel free. Dizzy nodded, still staring at the photo. He used to tell me stories about it. He'd say that one day he'd take me to see it, that we'd build sandcastles and look for seashells. She hesitated, her voice barely a whisper. But he never came. The weight of her words hung in the air, filling the silence with unspoken grief. Daria clenched her fists, feeling the surge of anger, not at Dizzy, but at Jade, at the lies he'd spun, at the promises he'd made and broken. She wanted to scream, to rail against him for abandoning them both. But instead, she took a deep breath, swallowing her bitterness. "I'm sorry," Daria murmured, her voice trembling. I didn't know about you. If I had, maybe things would have been different." Dizzy looked up at her, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I just wanted to know him. To know why he didn't come back." Daria felt a pang of sympathy that she didn't want to admit. She had no answers, no way to explain why Jade had kept Dizzy a secret, why he had promised her the world and then left her behind. But as she looked into Dizzy's tearful eyes, she felt a strange kinship, a shared pain that transcended the betrayal they'd both endured. Without thinking, Daria reached out and took Dizzy's hand, offering a small squeeze. "Maybe we can figure it out together." Dizzy's eyes widened in surprise, but a tentative smile broke through her sadness. It was a fragile truce, a moment of understanding that neither of them had expected. In that small gesture, they found solace, a hint of the family they both longed for, even if it was fractured and bruised. The days passed, and Daria and Dizzy settled into an unspoken routine. Daria would go to work during the day, leaving Dizzy to explore the house, to find her place within its walls. In the evenings, they would share quiet dinners, exchanging small talk that grew more comfortable with time. It was a tentative peace, a fragile beginning, but it was more than either of them had anticipated. One afternoon, Daria came home to find Dizzy sitting on the porch steps, a book open on her lap. She looked up as Daria approached, a shy smile playing on her lips. "I found this in the study," Dizzy explained, holding up the book. "It's about different places around the world. It reminds me of the stories he used to tell me." Daria's heart tightened as she recognized the book. Jade had bought it during their honeymoon, promising to one day show her all the places they'd read about together. She hadn't opened it since his death, hadn't been able to face the dreams they'd once shared. But now, as she watched Dizzy flipping through its pages with wide-eyed wonder, Daria felt a flicker of warmth. Maybe this was a chance to reclaim those dreams, to rebuild something from the ashes of what Jade had left behind. "Would you like to see those places someday?" Daria asked, surprising herself with the question. Dizzy's eyes sparkled, and she nodded eagerly. "Yes, more than anything. He told me about Paris and Rome, and the pyramids in Egypt. He said they were magical." Daria smiled, a genuine smile that felt foreign on her face. "Maybe we can make that happen someday." Dizzy's smile widened, her whole face lighting up. For the first time, Daria saw hope in her eyes, a hope that made her heart ache with a strange, unfamiliar warmth. It was as if, in that moment, they were no longer strangers brought together by betrayal, but two souls finding solace in each other. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the porch, Daria felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if she could ever fully forgive Jade or herself. But as she sat beside Dizzy, sharing quiet dreams and promises, she felt a glimmer of something she'd thought she'd lost. A chance to heal, to love, to find family once again. Little did they know, the secrets of the past were not finished with them yet. There was still much left to uncover, truths that would challenge the fragile bond they were building. But for now, in the golden light of dusk, they had found a moment of peace, a brief respite in the storm. And for Daria, that was enough. As weeks turned into months, Daria and Dizzy began to settle into a rhythm. Their connection grew slowly, almost imperceptibly, as small gestures of kindness and understanding bridged the emotional distance between them. Daria found herself softening in ways she hadn't expected, while Dizzy learned to let down her guard, cautiously letting herself trust. But the shadows of the past lingered, unspoken and heavy. Daria still struggled with Jade's betrayal, the lies he had kept hidden until his death. She was also grappling with guilt. Guilt for her initial coldness toward Dizzy, guilt for how she'd allowed her resentment to almost drive the girl away. She hadn't yet come to terms with her emotions, and every now and then, her old bitterness would surface, casting a chill over their fragile peace. One crisp autumn morning, Daria was sorting through a closet she hadn't touched since Jade's death. Dust swirled in the air as she pulled out boxes filled with mementos from their life together. Vacation photos, letters, small gifts they had given each other over the years. She felt a pang of sadness as she sifted through the memories, reminded of the life they had once shared, a life now tainted by his secrets. In one of the boxes, she found a small, intricately carved wooden box she hadn't seen before. It was tucked away under a pile of old birthday cards and letters, almost as if it had been hidden deliberately. Curious, she opened it and found a stack of yellowed papers neatly folded. Her heart skipped a beat as she unfolded the first sheet and recognized Jade's handwriting. Daria reached out, taking Dizzy's hands in her own. "I know, and I don't blame you for any of this. You're innocent in all of it. But I need you to understand. It's hard for me to look at you sometimes, because you're a reminder of the man I thought I knew. The man who lied to me." Dizzy nodded, her tears spilling over as she squeezed Daria's hands. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to hurt you." Daria's heart ached as she looked at the girl before her, a child who had lost as much as she had, a child who had been thrust into a world of secrets and lies without any choice. She pulled Dizzy into a hug, holding her close as they both cried, their shared grief a balm for their wounded hearts. "I don't know what the future holds," Daria murmured, her voice thick with emotion. "But I do know that I want to try. I want to try to be there for you, to give you the family you deserve." Dizzy nodded, clinging to Daria, as if she were a lifeline. "Thank you. I want that too." As they sat together in the garden, surrounded by the blooming flowers they had planted, Daria felt a sense of peace settle over her. The road ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges and painful memories. But for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a belief that they could heal, that they could build something new from the ashes of the past. In that moment, Daria realized that family wasn't defined by blood or by the lies that had torn them apart. It was something they could create together, something they could nurture and protect. And as she held Dizzy close, she made a silent promise to herself, to honor that bond, to fight for it, to let it heal the wounds that Jade had left behind. The days that followed were a mixture of delicate steps and slow healing, each moment a testament to the hard work of rebuilding trust and redefining family. Daria and Dizzy had finally opened the door to honesty, yet both were still feeling their way through the raw emotions that came with it. It was as if they had been bound by an invisible thread, taut with tension, and each movement required careful thought and gentleness. For Daria, this new reality felt surreal. She had spent so long nurturing her bitterness, holding tightly to her resentment against Jade's betrayal and the pain that Dizzy's presence initially evoked. But now, for the first time, she was beginning to see Dizzy for who she truly was, a young girl who had faced more heartbreak than most people her age. She was no longer just a reminder of Jade's hidden life. She was a person, a girl in desperate need of love, acceptance, and stability. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, the air filled with a quiet comfort, Dizzy timidly asked about Daria's past. "Tell me about you, before all of this." Her voice was hesitant, as if she were testing the boundaries of their growing bond. Daria looked at her, surprised by the question. It was something she hadn't thought about in a long time, her own life before the painful revelation of Jade's secret family. She took a deep breath, settling back into the soft cushions of the couch, and began to share pieces of herself she had locked away, memories that had been buried beneath her grief. "I was a schoolteacher before I met Jade," Daria began softly. "I loved working with children, watching them grow and learn. I felt like I was making a difference, even in small ways." Dizzy's eyes lit up. "Did you have a favorite student?" Daria chuckled, her eyes distant as she recalled the faces of her students. They were all special in their own ways, but there was one girl, Eliza, who reminded me so much of you. She looked at Dizzy, her smile softening. She was curious, compassionate, and strong-willed, always asking questions, just like you. Dizzy's cheeks flushed with a quiet pride, and she tucked a curl behind her ear. "Did you ever think of having kids back then?" The question landed with unexpected weight. Daria hesitated, feeling a pang in her heart as memories of her lost daughter rose unbidden to the surface. She hadn't spoken of her before, not even to Jade in the years they were married, as if the pain of her absence was too sacred to share. "Yes," Daria replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did. I always wanted to be a mother. But life, it didn't turn out the way I had planned." Dizzy seemed to sense the sadness in Daria's voice. She reached out, placing her hand on Daria's, offering a comfort that felt both natural and surprising. "I'm glad we found each other," Dizzy said, her voice full of sincerity, "even if it wasn't in the way either of us expected." Daria squeezed her hand, feeling the surge of affection that caught her off guard. In that moment, she realized how deeply she had come to care for this girl, how much she had begun to see her as her own. The bitterness that had once poisoned her heart was slowly dissolving, replaced by something infinitely more profound and healing. Over the next few weeks, their routine took on a new sense of purpose. Daria found herself cooking Dizzy's favorite meals, listening to her talk about school, and helping her with homework. Dizzy, in turn, took on small responsibilities around the house, eager to show her appreciation and prove herself as part of this makeshift family. They began to create memories together, filling the spaces once haunted by silence and resentment with laughter and warmth. One Saturday, Daria suggested they visit a nearby park she used to go to with Jade. She hesitated before asking, worried it might bring back painful memories, but Dizzy seemed excited by the idea. They packed a simple picnic and set out, the autumn leaves crunching under their feet as they walked side by side. The park was quiet, the air crisp and filled with the earthy scent of fallen leaves. They found a spot near a small pond, and Daria spread out a blanket. As they ate, they talked about simple things. Dizzy's favorite subjects, her dreams for the future. Daria listened with genuine interest, feeling a sense of pride in this young girl who had faced so much yet held on to her dreams with unwavering determination. As they were packing up, Dizzy suddenly asked, "Do you think my mom and dad ever loved each other? I mean, really loved each other?" The question caught Daria off guard, and for a moment, she wasn't sure how to respond. She considered her words carefully, wanting to offer comfort without denying the painful truths they both knew. "I think love can be complicated," Daria began slowly. "Sometimes people do love each other, but they make mistakes, or they hurt each other in ways they can't take back. Your dad, he may have loved your mother in his own way, but he was flawed. He made choices that hurt both of us." Dizzy nodded, her face thoughtful. I wish I could have known him. The real him." Daria reached out, brushing a stray tear from Dizzy's cheek. "I wish that too, sweetheart. But sometimes we don't get to know people the way we want. Sometimes we have to let go of the idea of who they were and focus on who we are now." Dizzy leaned into Daria's embrace, her small frame fitting perfectly against her. They sat in silence, watching the water ripple across the pond, their shared pain transforming into a bond neither had anticipated. The turning point came a few days later, when Daria received a letter from Jade's lawyer. It was unexpected, a reminder of the past she was trying so hard to leave behind. She opened it cautiously, her heart pounding as she read the contents. It was a trust fund left behind by Jade. He had set it up for Dizzy, a small but significant sum meant for her future education. The lawyer's note mentioned that Jade had established it in secret, perhaps as an attempt to make amends for his absence. The irony was not lost on Daria, and for a moment she felt a surge of anger. But as she looked at Dizzy, who was watching her with curious eyes, she knew that this wasn't about Jade anymore. It was about giving Dizzy the future she deserved. "Dizzy," Daria said, her voice soft but firm, "your father left something for you. Something he hoped would help you in the future." Dizzy's eyes widened. "He did." Daria nodded, handing her the letter. "It's a trust fund for your education. He may have made mistakes, but he wanted to make sure you had opportunities." Dizzy stared at the letter, her expression a mix of surprise and sadness. "I don't know if I should feel happy or sad." Daria placed a hand on her shoulder, pulling her into a gentle hug. "Feel whatever you need to feel, Dizzy. It's okay. Just know that you have people who care about you, who want the best for you, including me." In that moment, Dizzy looked up, her eyes filled with gratitude and a glimmer of something Daria hadn't seen before. Hope. It was as if the weight of the past had finally begun to lift, allowing her to see a future free from the shadows of betrayal and loss. That night, as they sat together, Daria felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She realized that the journey they had shared was one of healing, not just for Dizzy, but for herself as well. They had both been hurt by Jade's choices, but they had found strength in each other, learning to let go of the past and embrace the family they had created together. Daria knew that the scars would remain, reminders of the pain they had endured, but they were no longer bound by those scars. They were free to move forward, to build a future filled with love, resilience, and the quiet strength that had carried them through. As she tucked Dizzy into bed that night, Daria whispered softly, "I'm proud of you, Dizzy, and I'm grateful you're here with me." Dizzy's face softened into a sleepy smile, her hand reaching out to hold Daria's. "I'm grateful too. Thank you, Mom." The word lingered in the air, a fragile yet powerful acknowledgement of their bond. Daria's heart swelled with emotion as she leaned down to kiss Dizzy's forehead, feeling a sense of fulfillment she hadn't known was possible. They had found each other in the ruins of betrayal, and together they had built something beautiful, something that no one, not even Jade, could take away. Weeks turned into months, and Daria and Dizzy settled into a rhythm that felt almost like destiny, as if they had always been meant to find one another in the most unexpected way. The initial hardships, misunderstandings, and moments of resentment had given way to something richer and deeper, a shared commitment to healing and creating a future together. Despite the trials they had faced, they found themselves weaving an unbreakable bond, like roots finding purchase in rocky soil. As winter approached, Daria's small house transformed into a place of warmth and joy. Dizzy would come home from school with stories about her day, her laughter filling the rooms that had once echoed with silence. Daria, who had once shut herself away from the world in bitterness and regret, now felt herself unfurling, like a flower learning to bloom again after a long, harsh winter. She cooked Dizzy's favorite meals, helped her with homework, and even went to her school events, cheering her on as if she'd been doing it for years. One Saturday morning, as they were having breakfast, Dizzy looked up from her plate with a thoughtful expression. "Mom," she began, the word still feeling new on her lips but warming Daria's heart every time. "Do you think I could visit Dad's grave again?" The question took Daria by surprise. They hadn't spoken about Jade in months, both of them silently agreeing to let his memory rest. But she saw the need in Dizzy's eyes, the desire to make peace with a father she would never fully know. Daria took a deep breath, feeling the familiar sting of pain that Jade's name brought, yet she nodded. "Of course, honey," she replied softly, reaching out to squeeze Dizzy's hand. "We'll go together, whenever you're ready." That afternoon, they bundled up in warm coats and scarves and drove to the cemetery. The sky was overcast, a dull gray blanket that seemed to press down on the quiet landscape. Daria held Dizzy's hand tightly as they walked between the rows of gravestones, her heart beating in her chest like a drum. She felt both fear and a strange sense of resolve as they approached Jade's grave, the one place where their painful journey had begun. They reached the grave, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Dizzy knelt down, placing a small bouquet of wildflowers at the foot of the headstone. She ran her fingers over the engraved letters of his name, her expression a mixture of sadness and curiosity. "I never really knew you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "But I wish you'd been brave enough to let me and Mom meet sooner. Maybe things could have been different." Daria felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She wanted to say something comforting, but no words seemed adequate for the pain of a young girl who had been robbed of a father and a mother who had been betrayed. Instead, she knelt beside Dizzy, wrapping an arm around her shoulders as they both stared at the grave, lost in their own thoughts. After a moment, Dizzy turned to Daria, her face solemn. "Do you think he really loved us? Both of us?" Daria hesitated, her thoughts swirling. She had wrestled with this question countless times, questioning whether Jade's actions had been motivated by love or selfishness, whether he had been truly devoted or merely a man caught between two lives. But in the end, she realized that the answer no longer mattered. What mattered was the life they were building now. "I don't know, sweetheart," she answered honestly. "But I do know that love isn't always simple. People make mistakes, sometimes terrible ones, but love can still be real, even if it's flawed." Dizzy nodded, absorbing Daria's words. She leaned her head on Daria's shoulder, and together they sat in silence, their presence a quiet acknowledgement of the wounds they shared and the strength they had found in each other. As they drove home from the cemetery, Daria felt a weight lifting from her heart. Visiting Jade's grave hadn't been as painful as she'd feared. Instead, it had felt like closure, a chance to let go of the resentment she had harbored for so long. She realized that forgiveness wasn't about excusing Jade's actions, but about releasing herself from the chains of bitterness that had bound her. That evening, as they sat by the fireplace, sipping hot cocoa and watching the flames dance, Dizzy looked up at Daria with a shy smile. "Mom, I was thinking, maybe we could volunteer together. At the orphanage where I used to live. I want to give back, help other kids feel the love you've given me." The suggestion took Daria by surprise, but it filled her with a sense of pride and admiration for the young girl who had already endured so much yet still had so much compassion to offer. She nodded, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind Dizzy's ear. "I think that's a beautiful idea, Dizzy. I'd love to." The following weekend, they'd visited the orphanage. The place where Dizzy had spent so many years felt different now, less daunting with Daria by her side. They helped the children with their schoolwork, read them stories, and played games in the yard. Daria watched as Dizzy interacted with the other children, her kindness and warmth radiating like a beacon of hope. In the weeks that followed, volunteering at the orphanage became a regular part of their lives. Daria found a new purpose in helping others, and it became a source of joy that brought her and Dizzy closer. They were no longer just a mother and daughter healing from shared wounds. They were a team, united by a mission to make a difference in the lives of others. As Christmas approached, Daria decided to do something special for Dizzy. She wanted to celebrate the journey they had taken together and the family they had become. She spent weeks planning, searching for the perfect gifts, and even redecorating Dizzy's room to make it feel more like her own. On Christmas morning, Dizzy woke up to find her room transformed. Gone were the remnants of the past. In their place were bright colors, posters of her favorite artists, and a brand new bookshelf filled with books Daria had carefully selected. A small, beautifully decorated Christmas tree stood in the corner, its lights casting a warm glow over the room. Dizzy's eyes filled with tears as she took in the scene. She turned to Daria, her voice choked with emotion. "Mom, this is It's perfect. Thank you. Daria hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth of Dizzy's embrace seep into her heart. You deserve it, sweetheart, and so much more. That evening, they sat by the fireplace, opening gifts and sharing stories. The air was filled with laughter and love, the kind of warmth that only comes from a family that has endured hardship together. Daria realized that in loving and caring for Dizzy, she had found a deeper sense of purpose, a reason to move forward beyond the pain of her past. As the evening drew to a close, Dizzy looked up at Daria, her eyes shining with gratitude. Thank you for everything, Mom. For loving me, for giving me a home, and for helping me find peace. Daria brushed a tear from her own cheek, her heart overflowing with pride and love. Thank you, Dizzy, for being my daughter, for showing me what it means to truly forgive, and for helping me become the person I always wanted to be. They held each other in the soft glow of the fire, knowing that their journey together was just beginning. They had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, but together they had built a family grounded in resilience, forgiveness, and unconditional love. And as they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, Daria knew that she had finally found her way home.